We've got now a third session on the trials of Jesus, based on Mark 15 from verse 16 through to verse 41. Initially, we're looking just at 16 to 20, and then we'll move on. Verse 16. Mark has the whole procedure with Pilate taking place in front of Pilate's residence. The chief priests were okay there in a public place rather than inside a Gentile's house. Outside there they would not be made unclean, and they would not be rendered unable to take part in the festival. John tells us in his Gospel a lot more about what went on there, and he has Pilate take Jesus into his residence for a meaningful conversation with him. Jesus, of course, would not have cared about being made ritually unclean by being in a Gentile's house. But once Jesus had been sentenced, the soldiers take him indoors, or possibly into an inner courtyard in the residence, and they have to get together a detachment of troops to carry out the sentence. Verses 17 to 20. At this point, we ought to spare a thought for those soldiers. We're aware these days of what a soldier's duties can do to him or her, like giving them PTSD. People haven't changed over the centuries, and my guess is that if those troops were going to nail this man to a cross and stand by while he wrestled with trying to stay alive, it would have helped those soldiers enormously if they could manage to persuade themselves that the man was trash, hardly human, certainly not worth their sympathies. So the way that they mocked him was probably designed to distance themselves from him as a person, designed to confirm them in the opinion that he wasn't worthy of their sympathies. Move on then from that mocking to the crucifixion itself, verses 21 to 32. 21. Part of the process of shaming the victim was to lead him through the streets from the place where he was sentenced to the place of execution. Think of the tumbrils taking prisoners to the guillotine during the French Revolution. It helped that process enormously if they made the victim carry his own cross on that journey. I mean, we always picture Jesus with the entire cross on his shoulders, but it seems that it was more usual for the victim to carry just the crossbeam rather than the whole thing. But it looks as if Jesus had already been so thoroughly knocked about by the soldiers that he was clearly not capable of carrying that load himself. And the soldiers didn't see why they should carry it for him, so they pressed a bystander to do it for him. This Simon isn't mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament, but there is a little clue in the text. Mark says he's the father of Alexander and Rufus. That note would have no meaning unless Mark knew that some of his readers would know one or both of Alexander and Rufus. And the obvious supposition is that Alexander and Rufus were believers by the time that Mark published his work, that is. I think we can guarantee that these two would have worn it like a badge of pride, that their dad was the one who carried the Lord's cross. So when Mark introduces Simon here, he is in effect saying, you know that Alexander and Rufus are always telling you that their dad carried Jesus' cross. That's Simon. That's the Simon we're talking about. 22 and 23. The soldiers would have to guard the crucifixion site for some hours, and they would have had a quantity of cheap wine there to keep them going. Wine vinegar, it's usually called. It was probably some of that they offered Jesus. Dull your senses with a glass or two of this, and the myrrh in it will help as well. But you can imagine that Jesus would think that being crucified whilst half comatose would be a dereliction of duty on his part, so he declined the drink. Verse 24. There were two versions of crucifixion. One in which the victim's arms were tied to the crossbeam with ropes, and the deluxe version in which nails were used instead or as well. Although none of the accounts of the crucifixion mentions the nails, some of the resurrection appearances have Jesus showing them the marks in his hands, so it must have been that his crucifixion was with the full works. 25 and 26. I don't know whether it was usual to have the charge displayed on the cross, but it did happen with Jesus. A notice was pinned to the cross saying that he was the King of the Jews. That confirms that although the Sanhedrin had convicted him of blasphemy, the charge on which the Romans executed him was treason. Take a journey back to Mark 10 from verse 33, Jesus' third prophecy of his passion. Again he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. We are going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. And 3 days later he will rise. Notice how Jesus knows that he'll be handed over to the Romans by the leaders of his own people. He knows too that he'll be the recipient of substantial abuse before they execute him. Verse 27. There were clearly some convicted rebels already on death row. Barabbas had been let off, but the other two, probably colleagues of his in that failed revolt, they were left to pay the price of their own failure. If you're going to the trouble of arranging a crucifixion, it could save you work to deal with more than one victim, but there's more. These two were known insurrectionists, men who'd staged a revolt against Roman rule and failed. Jesus had obviously failed at his coup, trying to set himself up as the King of the Jews, so it worked well in Romans' eyes to lump him together with these other two failures. From our point of view, Jesus being crucified with these rebels takes us back to the last verse of Isaiah 53, that he was numbered with the transgressors. And it's likely to remind us of some of the other powerful things which that last servant song in Isaiah said are fulfilled in Jesus. Luke actually points out this connection when he tells the story in Luke 22:37, and some old manuscripts copy that verse from Luke as verse 28 in our current chapter of Mark. That's why in your Bible you probably don't have a verse 28 in chapter 15, because it shouldn't really be there. Verses 29 and 30. Golgotha was a public place. Much of the point of crucifixion was that people should see the victim's suffering and shame and resolve not to end up the same way themselves. So there were people passing by who joined in distancing themselves from Jesus. Some of them even trotted out that old accusation of his having made a threat against the temple. 31 and 32. The chief priests and others fed this mockery. They wanted as many people as possible to think that Jesus was trash. It says that their mockery was among themselves, but it reads as if everyone else could hear it too. They're saying that if he was a real Messiah, he wouldn't still be up there on that cross. He would have freed himself and shown everyone his real power. He would have made of himself the greatest sign he could ever give to compel belief in him. But he clearly had not done it. Told you so. Even the other two victims joined in the mockery. And so to the account of Jesus' death from verse 33 to 41. Before we proceed with Mark's text, we need to take a look at Psalm 22. Perhaps you could turn to Psalm 22. It would be useful actually to have it in front of you while we're looking at this. In my copy, there are some words which are highlighted. At the beginning of verse 3, yet. At the beginning of verse 6, but. At the beginning of verse 9, yet. At verse 19, another but. In other words, in the psalm, David is alternating between despair and hope. The psalm is a dialogue within himself as to whether there is hope or whether he's had it. But at verse 19, there starts the long final assertion of hope. So hope triumphs. Back to Mark 15, verse 33. The darkness feels right as a commentary on the horrendous nature of what was happening, but it's not obvious what was the physical component of that darkness. You often hear people thinking it was an eclipse, but that wouldn't make the darkness last for 3 hours. More likely, I think it consisted of storm clouds lowering over the scene. Verse 34. On the cross, Jesus quotes the first verse of Psalm 22. The quotation as Mark gives it seems to be an attempt to record the sounds made by Jesus quoting in Aramaic. One of the few places where we have a clear indication of the actual sounds that Jesus made. Mark, of course, was writing in Greek for people who mostly did not speak Aramaic, so he adds a translation in Greek as well as trying to convey the actual sounds in Greek characters. Before the invention of chapter and verse numbers in the scriptures, quoting the first verse of this psalm would usually be regarded as citing the whole psalm. That would mean that Jesus was confessing his agony of soul along with his more obvious agony of body, and yet was declaring that he was just about able to hang on to his hope in God. He was down, but not quite out. Conclusion. So the superficial reading of verse 34 in Mark is that Jesus had lost hope. The deeper reading is that he was pushed to the limit, but just managed to hold on to hope. Verse 35. Even at the scene there was an issue of understanding what Jesus was saying. I hardly think that there on the cross Jesus was using his very best public speaking voice, so it could have been quite easy to mishear what he was saying. It seems that some thought that they could hear him calling Eli, that is Elijah, rather than Eloi, my God. Verse 36. We've already noticed that the soldiers would have had there a quantity of pretty rough plonk for their own use, wine vinegar or vinegary wine. It looks like an act of kindness that someone soaked a sponge in this plonk and offered it to Jesus on a stick. Let it at least do something to slake his thirst. It doesn't say whether Jesus took up the offer. This same person was working on the assumption that Jesus was calling on Elijah, and he showed an interest in seeing if Elijah would in fact turn up to rescue Jesus. Verse 37. The principal cause of death through crucifixion was suffocation. Hanging by his arms, the victim would find it hard to breathe in and had to haul himself up in order to do so. Eventually, sheer exhaustion would make it impossible to do that, and he would suffocate. It sounds here as if Jesus made one last effort to get his breath, and then used whatever breath he had to cry out, and then that was it. Verses 38 and 39. I want to comment on these two verses, but I'm going to do so within a survey of the structure of Mark's Gospel. First of all, the title and climax of Mark's Gospel. It starts off announcing that this is going to be the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Verse 39 in the passage we're just looking at constitutes the climax of the Gospel, where Mark announces that he's achieved his goal of portraying Jesus as the Son of God, a goal all the more assured because it was a Gentile who announced the verdict here. I think that's what's going on here, that the centurion clearly perceives that of all the participants in this awful sequence of events, Jesus alone stands out as someone to be admired. He alone maintained his dignity, not the Sanhedrin who arrested him and rushed him through a trial in the middle of the night, not Herod who treated him as a source of entertainment, not Pilate who knew that Jesus had done no wrong and yet refused to take responsibility for his own judgment, not the other two who were crucified with Jesus because they were being punished for the wrong they'd clearly done, not even the centurion and his execution squad, who in a real job's worth were really just doing their duty, following orders. Through that sequence of events, one man stands out as different from all the rest. One man emerged with his reputation intact, and that was Jesus, and the centurion noticed it. The charge sheet announced that Jesus was being executed for treason, for claiming to be the King of the Jews. Everyone knew, though, that the Jewish leaders were much more bothered by their own charge against him, blasphemy, claiming to be the Son of God. Certainly what the centurion had seen inclined him to side with Jesus against all the rest. If the explanation was that Jesus was the Son of God, then the centurion was ready to take that seriously. It made sense. Jesus was a man of such evident stature that such a claim could stand. Even as Jesus died, the verdict stood. Yes, he was Son of God. I've got a rather delightful translation of the Bible, which is the French version of the Good News Bible, and it has, as the end of its introduction to Mark's Gospel. Après avoir lu l'Évangile selon Marc, reconnaîtrez-vous aussi, comme l'officier romain, que Jésus de Nazareth était vraiment le Fils de Dieu. You've read through the Gospel of Mark. Don't leave without reminding yourself, like that Roman officer saw, the evidence that Jesus stood out from the others, stood out enough for you to take seriously the suggestion that he was Son of God. We're looking at the structure of Mark's Gospel so we can see the end of it in context. So we've looked at some of the introduction and the climax there. Let's go back into the body of the Gospel and look at the messianic secret. Something we noticed earlier in Mark's story often gets called the messianic secret, that throughout his early ministry, Jesus tells people to keep quiet about who he really is. When we were looking at that part of the story, I explained that as Jesus I explained it as Jesus buying time, creating space in which he could exercise his ministry without being overly mobbed by the crowds or arrested by the authorities. And the first departure from this playing down of the issue was on the road to Caesarea Philippi, when, alone with his disciples, he asked them to pronounce on who he was. And you'll remember that it was Peter who found the courage to put it into words, "You are the Messiah." And then on Palm Sunday, Jesus went unambiguously public. His riding up to Jerusalem on a donkey, surrounded by the crowds of Passover pilgrims, was an acted claim to be Messiah, and all the crowds recognized it as such. That resulted in the extremely public act of Good Friday, where the official verdict was pronounced on him for all to see, but where at least one man saw through that and got a glimpse of what was really going on, and that one man was the centurion. The messianic secret was out. Perhaps only one man managed to notice that at this point, but others would soon join him. Let's go back just a little bit then from that point, still trying to capture the structure of Mark's Gospel, because there are 3 points leading up to the end where Mark recalls Jesus prophesying his own death and resurrection. The first is straight after Peter's confession on the road to Caesarea Philippi, Mark 8 verse 31. He didn't get a very good reception from the disciples. Peter openly rebuked him for talking in this way. The second is in chapter 9 from verse 31. This was at a high point of his ministry when he had cast out a spirit which had defied the disciples. And he seems to be saying here that what's coming, well, we've got to cut off any cheap triumphalism. That's not going to be how it is. And the last prophecy of the Passion is in chapter 10 from verse 32. Clearly the disciples were at a loss to work out what Jesus was on about in these prophecies. But I presume it's fair to assume that Jesus himself understood them. So you could take the line that if Jesus really believed what he said in these prophecies, then he knew that death was for him a temporary interruption of life, so that he could pass through it calmly. But of course, calmly isn't how it happened. As he was dying, as we've seen, Jesus was in real agony, agony of body quite obviously, and agony of soul, as he wrestled with his perception of what was real. What was this emptiness and darkness the most real thing, or was there actually some light beyond it? I remember my dad saying as his own death approached, "I don't mind the thought of death. I know where I'm going, but I don't look forward to the business of dying." For Jesus, the business of dying was unutterably awful, so much so that it threatened even his spiritual integrity. Witness his wrestling with Psalm 22. But he was able to hold on to his awareness that the story would continue beyond that point. John Henry Newman referred to the double agony in man for man. Jesus suffered in man, in that as a human being he was put through the most appalling suffering. Alongside that, he suffered for man, in that through that human experience he was trying to hold on to the unique task he'd been given, trying to hold on to his grasp of who he was and what he was doing. And this citing of Psalm 22 suggests that he succeeded in holding on to it, but probably only just. Letter to the Romans, chapter 1, verse 4. And who through the Spirit of holiness was declared with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead, that is Jesus Christ our Lord. That is, the point at which the verdict, the Son of God, can most obviously be pronounced clearly on Jesus, is when he was raised from the dead. But a lot of the time, Paul presents Christ crucified as the main evidence, not Christ raised. I think that Paul was more than happy with the centurion's verdict, but coming to that verdict on the evidence of Good Friday alone is bound to be a minority activity. Not many are going to make it. More people will be able to join in as Easter Day confirms the centurion's judgment. On Good Friday, the evidence is hidden and to a degree still ambiguous. On Easter Day, anyone who can see the evidence will regard it as sounding a trumpet for Jesus as Son of God. So, well done, centurion, for spotting the truth on Good Friday. Thank you, Father, for not leaving it there. There's one more strange verse. Verse 38, that the curtain of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom. This is there almost as a throwaway line. It doesn't seem to explain itself. It doesn't seem to tie in with anything else. To be honest, I don't know whether that actual veil in the temple was ripped in two at this time, or whether this is picture language. I don't much care, in fact. What I do care about is what it means. The veil of the temple was the thick curtain which separated the holy place from the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. The inner part of the temple was somewhere where only the specially appointed priests were allowed to go. They had set duties there, and they were able to go in and do those duties after purifying themselves in the appropriate way. But beyond that place there was an even more inner part, where at one time the Ark of the Covenant had been housed, and it was there that God himself was said to live on earth. Only one man was ever allowed into that room, that was the high priest, and that only on one day of the year, the Day of Atonement. The imagery of the veil being torn in two from the top to the bottom is that as an act of God, that situation was abolished, in which the place where God lives on earth is hidden away from the rest of the world. On the cross, the place where God lives on earth was as public as you could possibly get, not even in the temple, let alone in its most secret place. And the force of our story today is that the one person standing in that place who recognized that he was in the presence of God wasn't even a Jew, let alone a priest. From that moment on, the thought had gone forever that you had to be the right person in the right holy place to find yourself in the presence of God. The veil was torn in two because it had been made totally irrelevant. Its job had been abolished. Certainly, this man was the Son of God. Bless you.